Martin Luther King Jr. was a traveling young minister who would travel, whether it's in the North or the South. He would speak at different congregations, and he was presented with the offer to work for the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. At the time, he also had two other offers to be a minister in the North, and it was a really big internal struggle for him whether he wanted to pursue the opportunity at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church or to stay in the North where there was true equality. At the time in Alabama, there was a strong presence of segregation. At the time, the Supreme Court had ruled that it was illegal to have segregation, that schools should be desegregated, yet that area of Alabama found it still acceptable to have schools segregated and to have the segregation of the buses and other public areas. One thing that Martin Luther King talked about was the passivity of the African American community. He found that even when there was issues, whenever there was one man who did walk off the bus and asked how many other of his fellow Negroes would follow, none of them raised their hand. Before Rosa Parks was arrested, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin was arrested in handcuffs. She was 15 years old. She was arrested for not allowing her seat on the bus to be taken by a white person. And this kind of started a ruffle within the Black community. They felt that they needed to do something, but they didn't know what to do. And then a little bit later, Rosa Parks was arrested, and that was kind of the final straw. Reverend Roy Bennett began the interdenominational ministry, and that was the group that decided that the bus boycott was going to happen. They were the ones that brought all of the ministers in the area together to decide on the action that needed to be taking place. And they decided that the community, the Black community, was not going to take the bus on a certain day. And it was that ministry's job to slim out the logistics of everything. Martin Luther King Jr. himself was very anxious for all of it to happen. He was expecting about a 60% participation rate.
December 5th was quite the special day. That's the day when all of this began. There was almost 100% participation with the bus boycott. An organization needed to be set up. That organization would come to be known as the Montgomery Improvement Association. It was decided that the boycott would carry on until the demands were met. There were three demands. The first one was courteous treatment by the bus operators. The second was that it was a first come, first served basis, with the Negroes starting from the back and the white folks starting from the front. And the third, that Negro operators would be hired for the primarily Negro routes. Several committees needed to be set up to run it. The key players amongst all of that, besides Martin Luther King Jr., were Fred Gray, E.D. Nixon, and Ralph Abernathy. At first, the taxis charged a discounted rate, the same rate that the buses charged. However, soon after, the commissioner reminded the taxi drivers that they had to charge at least 48 cents a fare. So a carpool system was set up. Thanks to the press coverage, donations poured in from all across the world, even overseas. All of this began with MLK growing up in Atlanta. He saw the injustices that not only the blacks faced, but the poor white men. When he became a freshman in college at Morehouse College, he read the essay Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau. That really sparked his passion and his enthusiasm for nonviolence, resistance, and love. Henry Thoreau was a little ways down the philosopher line, so he decided to start all the way from the beginning to find out where love began and how resistance began. he started over all the way even to Socrates. Throughout his college years, he read on and got to Karl Marx eventually and started learning about communism. He believed that communism as a whole system was flawed, but he also, after further reading, believed that capitalism as a whole system was flawed. After continued research, MLK really kind of settled on nonviolent resistance was the key to everything.
All right, initially the white community felt like the boycott would just fizzle out in time. They thought like after rain or snow, everyone would just be back on the buses, but that turned out not to be true. After they realized that the boycott wasn't going to stop due to some rain or snow, they met with like the city commissioners and the mayor, met with some of the leaders in the black community to try to come up with a solution to end the boycott. They kind of argued back and forth with the white leaders, never really reached an agreement. The white leaders always arguing that it couldn't happen within their segregation laws, and the black leaders saying that it could, but they never reached an agreement. So after those two meetings failed, white community leaders, just kind of like the white population of Montgomery, started kind of spreading rumors and things that like the conditions weren't getting better quicker because of who was leading the movement, and that if there were different leaders, the movement would be moving along quicker. Later on, they also put out a statement that they had met with three prominent black ministers who had agreed to an arrangement that the bus company had come up with, but that turned out not to be true. After that, the police force put out a Get Tough policy, which increased police harassment when it came to black citizens. They would pull people over for the most minor things. Martin Luther King was pulled over and arrested for going 30 in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. So after they realized the boycott wasn't going to end, the MIA started receiving violent phone calls 30 to 40 times a day. Martin heard that someone was planning to take his life. He had trouble sleeping that night, and he kind of felt overwhelmed and felt like he wanted to give up. But he prayed to God, and he felt like a renewed strength and like was completely confident that this was the right thing to do. So Martin was at a mass meeting when everyone around him started to act a little strange. It eventually reached him that his house had been bombed. He was still really calm from the experience he had had praying to God a few days earlier. So he kind of calmly but quickly went home to check on his wife and kid. They were safe. So the police commissioner and the mayor were there, and they kind of expressed their regret that this had happened. Someone made a comment saying that, you know, they may regret that this had happened, but it was kind of their Get Tough policy that created the environment for this type of thing to happen. There was a large group of people outside that were ready to get violent, but Martin kind of calmed down the crowd and let them know that nonviolence is the way we need to handle this. So plans were made to arrest 100 members of the black community in regards to an anti-boycott law. Martin Luther was out of the state at the time, but he cut his trip short. As soon as Martin got back to Montgomery, he went to the jail. He was booked and released on bond, and he realized that a bunch of the people in the community had immediately gone to the jail as well to see if their name was on the list to be arrested. Everyone was kind of proud of the movement. So a trial happened for these arrests. There were 28 defendants who all came forward and told just kind of horrendous stories. One guy was shot after refusing to get off the bus without a refund, and another one was dragged alongside the bus after his leg had gotten caught in the door. Still, Judge Eugene Carter found all of the black members of the crime guilty. After losing these cases, the black community decided that segregation itself needed to be attacked. They took a case to the federal courts, declaring that the bus segregation was unconstitutional in regards to the 14th Amendment. They won that case with a 2-1 decision at the federal level, and the city immediately decided that it would be appealed. It was appealed at the Supreme Court level, and even though it took a couple months, it was eventually ratified, and the bus segregation laws were declared unconstitutional. It took about a month for that mandate to reach Montgomery after the Supreme Court made the decision, but they had finally gotten the segregation on the buses ended. The mayor started a movement to do whatever they could to make it unlawful for the carpool to continue, and they eventually had a case that kind of put a halt to the carpool. During the case that put an end to the carpool, they received a decision from the Supreme Court saying that the segregation laws were unconstitutional. Even though they had received the mandate from the Supreme Court saying the segregation was unconstitutional, there was a lot of backlash from the white community. Bombings started occurring again. After these bombings, prominent members of the white community started speaking out against them, and the police force, for the first time, actually started investigating these bombings. They arrested 7 people, they indicted 5, but none of them were found guilty. Even though none of them were found guilty, this kind of put an end to the violence.
The segregation ended in 1956. People believe that it's becoming easier to take public transportation and to mix white and black races, but there's still conflict. There's still conflict in that aspect because the older generation still believes that in their head there is still always going to be racial segregation. Whites and blacks are never going to get along, and that's just how they believe it. But the younger crowd and the educated crowd and the professional crowd believes that it's getting better. There's less violence for, like in the crowd, there's less fights, there's no violence on the bus as much, but the whites are still going to say that a black person is being violent with them or mugging them or robbing them. Like an instance on the bus happened, and a white woman accused a black man of stealing her purse, and that never happened, but he was still fined and still jailed because he was black. And this is still after the segregation has ended. The biggest part that I think has changed is that the voting rights is that they separated the counties, and there is a 7-to-1 black to white ratio. So there's always going to be more blacks. So the way that they separated their counties was that there was always going to be more whites than blacks. Therefore, blacks couldn't be politicians or educators or leaders in that field. Also, the MIA, they set up a 10-point system where it's supposed to help improve their communities, improve education, and helping people get on their feet out of the black communities to help them navigate outside of that violence area. So the big question that was asked in their communities is, what do we do? Where are we going from here? And at that point, there's only up. Segregation has ended and migration has begun, and these blacks are beginning to learn how to get out of the area, and their biggest drive and their biggest motivation to get out of the area was the Great Depression and the invention of automobiles. Another thing is that they believe that their respect has gotten better. They're starting to have more confidence in themselves, have more confidence in, their futures, for their children, for their grandkids, because they went through a lot of horrible things, between being abused, being killed, being murdered, being just judged based upon the way that they look or the way that they were born. They have more dignity, and they have more strength to kind of move away from what's going on. They believe that, legislators can't be moral. It has to be your behavior that kind of helps you determine. It's your behavior that helps you determine, who you're going to be, what you're going to be, and how you're going to teach people.